Students, today we will learn the chapter 4 of history, the making of global world. When we talk of globalization, we often refer to an economic system that had emerged since the last 50 years or so. But as you will see in this chapter, the making of global world has a long history of trade, of migration of people in search of work, the movement of capital, and much else. Globalization started with trade, migration of people in search of work, and the movement of capital. The Silk Route are good examples of pre-modern trade and the cultural links between remote part of the world. The Silk Route were the routes through which trade and cultural mingling of far-flung parts of the world took place. China was known for the trade of the silk since ancient period. Now in this map, you can see the overseas trade links of India with eastern and western countries, and here the inland trade routes, the Silk Route. Chinese silk cargoes used to travel through these routes, and from there it got its name Silk Routes. Later, Chinese pottery, textiles and spices from India and Southeast Asia also traveled the same routes. In return, precious metals like gold and silver flowed from Europe to Asia. Trade and cultural exchange always went hand in hand. Several Silk routes helped in linking Asia with Europe and North Africa. Buddhism, which emerged from eastern India, also spread through the same routes, interconnecting points of Silk Route. Food is a good example of long-distance cultural exchange. Traders and travelers introduced a new crops of the land they traveled. For instance, spaghetti and noodles. It is believed that noodles traveled west from China to become spaghetti. Pasta of Arab traveled to Italy. Many of our common food such as potatoes, soya, groundnuts, maize, tomatoes, chillies, sweet potatoes were introduced in Europe and Asia after America was discovered. For centuries before, the Indian Ocean had known a vibrant trade with goods, people, knowledge, customs, etc. But the introduction of new sea route to Asia found by European sailors in 16th century adversely affected the trade through Indian Ocean. By the mid-16th century, Europe defeated America. The European conquest was not just a result of superior firepower. In fact, it were the germs, such as those of smallpox, that they carried on their person that killed America's original inhabitants on a large scale. These people had no immunity against these diseases. Smallpox, in particular, proved to be a deadly killer. It devastated the whole community, thus paving the way for European conquest. Now, let us see three types of movements or flows were identified by the economist within international economic exchange. First was the flow of trade, that is trade in goods, then the flow of labor, that is migration, the movement of capital, that is the movement of investment. All the three flows were closely interlinked and affected people's life. The 19th century Britain lacked self-sufficiency in food. It was because of the uncontrolled growth of population and expansion of urban centers and industries. As a result, prices of food grains increased. People started importing food from other countries where it was cheaper. The government restricted the import of corn under the provisions of laws called Corn Laws. The industrialists and urban dwellers opposed the Corn Laws and demanded their abolition. Finally, the Corn Laws were abolished, which brought a lot of changes in British economy. Now, food could be imported in Britain at much cheaper rates than before. British agriculture failed to compete with imports. Vast areas of land were left uncultivated. Thousands of men and women became unemployed. This led to migration of people to cities or overseas. As food prices fell, the consumption in Britain rose. It further led to faster industrial growth in Britain, higher incomes, and more food imports. To meet the high demand of Britain, several steps were taken, like lands were cleared and food production was expanded in Eastern Europe, Russia, America, and Australia. Now, railways were needed to link agricultural regions to the ports. New harbors were built and old ones were expanded to ship the new cargoes. New homes and settlements were built to settle the workers. Capital flowed from financial capital like London. The demand of labor led to more migration. Nearly 50 million people immigrated from Europe to America and Australia in the 19th century. Thus, by the 1890, a global agricultural economy started with some complex changes in labor movement patterns, capital flow, ecologies, and technology. Food was now brought from thousands of miles away. It was grown by agricultural workers on lands after clearing the forest. Lands were cultivated not by peasants owning this land, but by hired workers brought from distant lands. Railways, ships, new ports, etc. were introduced or built for transportation. Food for transportation by railways and by ships. The workers were paid very low and were from Asia, Africa, or the Caribbean islands. Some changes occurred in Punjab also. Irrigation canals were built by the British Indian government to transform desert lands into fertile agricultural lands in order to grow wheat and cotton for export. The canal colonies were settled by peasants from other parts of Punjab. Cotton cultivation expanded worldwide to feed the British textile mills. Now, let us see about the role of technology. The important invention like the railways, steamships, and the telegraph triggered economic growth in the 19th century. Colonisation stimulated new investments and improvement in transport. Faster railways, lighter wagons, and large ships helped move food cheaply and quickly from far away farms to the final markets. Meat, which was an expensive luxury beyond the reach of the European poor, became affordable and its demand increased. Development of new technology, namely refrigerated ships, made this possible. Animals were now slaughtered for food at the starting point, like America, Australia, or New Zealand, and then transported to Europe as frozen meat. This reduced shipping costs and lowered meat prices. Now, early colonialism. Late 19th century Europe conquests produced many painful economic, social, and ecological changes through which the colonized societies were brought into the world economy. In 1885, the big European powers met in Berlin to complete the carving up of Africa between them. Britain and France made vast additions. Germany and Belgium became new colonial powers. The US also became a colonial power in the late 1890s. Now, Rinderpest or the cattle plague. In the 1880s in Africa, Rinderpest, a fast-spreading disease of the cattle, had a terrifying impact on people's livelihood and the local economy. Rinderpest killed 90% of the cattle. The loss of cattle destroyed African livelihoods. It strengthened colonial government's power, and Africans were forced into the labor market. Now let us study about indentured labor, migration from India. Migration from India started in the 19th century. Thousands of Indians and Chinese labor migrated to work in plantations, in mines, and in road and railway construction projects around the world. Most of the Indians were hired under contracts for 5 years in the Caribbean islands, Mauritius, and Fiji. They came back from the present day Eastern UP, Bihar, central India, and dry districts of Tamil Nadu. Indentured labor was nothing but a new system of slavery. Living and working conditions were harsh with few legal rights, but workers discovered their own way of surviving. They developed new forms of individual and collective self expression by blending different cultural forms. For example, in Trinidad, the annual Muharram procession became a riotous carnival called Jose for Imam Hussian, in which workers of all religion and races joined. Most indentured laborers preferred to stay back after their contracts ended. For example, Shiv Narain Chandrapal, Ram Naresh, Sharwan, etc., Nobel Prize winner V.S. Naipaul. India's nationalist leader opposed the system of indentured labor, calling it abusive and cruel, and after a long wait, it was abolished in 1921. Now, let us study about the Indian entrepreneurs abroad. With the increase in demand of growing food and other crops, the need of capital arose. Large plantations borrowed it from banks and markets, but the poor farmers couldn't do so. Shikaripuri shroffs and Nattukotai Chettiars were amongst the many groups of bankers and traders who financed export agriculture in Central and Southeast Asia, using either their own funds or those borrowed from European banks. They had a sophisticated system to transfer money over large distances and develop indigenous forms of corporate organizations. Indian trade, colonialism, and the global system. Due to the economic policy of the British imposition of tariffs on cloth imports into Britain, the inflow of fine Indian cotton began to decline, and British manufacturers flooded the Indian markets. Food, grain, and raw material exported from India to Britain and the rest of the world increased. The value of British export to India was much more higher than the value of British imports from India. Thus, Britain had a trade surplus with India. Britain used this trade surplus to balance trade deficit with other countries, that is, with countries from which Britain was importing more than it was selling to. Thus, India played a crucial role in the late 19th century world economy by helping Britain balance its deficit. Now, let us study about the interwar economy. The third topic. The impact of the World War I on the world was widespread. During this period, the whole world experienced economic and political instability and other disastrous war. It was the first modern industrial war as it saw the use of machine guns, tanks, aircrafts, chemical weapons, etc. on a large scale. The scale of death and destruction was beyond imagination. Household income declined. After the war, Britain failed to recapture its earlier position of dominance in the Indian market and to compete with Japan internationally. Britain had a huge debt borrowed from US. Unemployment increased because of the closure of many industries. Agricultural economies were also in crisis. Wheat production in Canada, America, and Australia expanded dramatically and declined in Eastern Europe. Grains prices fell, rural incomes declined, and farmers fell into debt. However, recovery was quicker in America. The war helped boost the US economy. One important feature of the US economy was mass production. A well-known pioneer of mass production was Henry Ford. The housing and consumer boom in the 1920s created the basis of US prosperity. In this picture, you can see the manufacturing of Ford motors. Now, the Great Depression. The Great Depression began from 1929 and lasted till the mid-1930s. During this period, agricultural production, employment, incomes, and trade declined drastically. Agricultural regions and economies were the worst affected. This was because of the fall of agricultural prices, then the prices of industrial goods. When the crisis started, US began to withdraw loans which affected the rest of the world. Several major banks failed and currencies collapsed, such as the British pound sterling. In Latin America, the agricultural and raw material price declined. In order to protect its economy, US doubled the import duties, which gave a severe blow to the world trade. Indian exports and imports nearly halved between 1928 and 1934. Prices in India fell terribly. Between 1928 and 1934, wheat prices fell by 50%. Though agricultural prices fell sharply, but colonial government did not reduce revenue demands. It eventually affected the peasants. The depression proved less grim for urban India. Middle class salaried employees found themselves better off. US Bank cut the domestic lending and called bank loans. As a result, farmers failed to sell their harvest, household ruined, and business collapsed. Thus, the Great Depression affected the society, politics, and international relations. The impact of the Great Depression was widespread. In the 19th century, as colonial India was an exporter of agricultural goods and importer of manufactures, Indian trade immediately got affected due to the Great Depression. The Second World War was fought between the Axis power and the Allied powers. It continued for 6 years. It caused enormous destruction and 60 million people killed and millions injured. In order to preserve economic stability and full employment in the industrial world, the post-war economic system was established. To execute the same, the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference was held in July 1944 at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, USA. The Bretton Woods Conference established the International Monetary Fund (IMF) to deal with external surpluses and shortages of its member nations. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, that is World Bank, was set up to finance post-war reconstruction. The IMF and the World Bank are referred to as Bretton Woods Institutions or sometimes the Bretton Woods Twins. Decision-making authority was given to the Western Industrial Powers. The US was given the right to veto over key IMF and World Bank decisions. The Bretton Woods system was based on fixed exchange rates. The Bretton Woods system opened a new era of unique growth of trade and incomes for the Western industrial nations and Japan. World trade grew annually with stability and without large fluctuations. Developing countries invested in large amounts of capital, importing industrial plant and equipment featuring modern technology. After the Second World War, many parts of the world were still under colonial rule, and it took over 2 decades to decolonize Asia and Africa. When they became free, they faced many problems such as poverty, lack of resources. The IMF and the World Bank were designed to meet the financial needs of the industrial countries, and so no attention was paid towards the newly independent Asian and African countries. As most of the developing countries were not much benefited from the fast growth, they formed a group called the Group of 77, G77. They demanded a new international economic order, NIEO, with actual control over their natural resources. Here you can see the logos of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, IMF. Their other demands were more developmental assistance, fairer prices for raw materials, and better access to their manufactured goods in developed countries' markets. The Bretton Woods ultimately ended and globalization began. Multinational corporations are large companies that operate in several countries at the same time. The first MNCs were established in 1920s. It's spread worldwide in the 1950s and 60s. Now, most of the MNCs have shifted their attention towards India and China because of the cheap labor and huge market in these countries. This is the logo of Group of 77, that is G77.